Good afternoon. It's actually scary to hear some of those statistics. I had no idea the crisis that the nursing profession may be facing, especially considering the population aging and what that's going to mean. And I certainly can sympathize with some of the things that you've been observing in Russia, because I observe very similar things in China. So my name's Don Samulack. I'm the president U.S. operations of Editage, part of the Cactus Communications company. The little guy there, Dr. Eddy, is really an avatar of our educational initiative. So Dr. Eddy personifies the efforts of Editage to support authors with good publication practices. And we take this very seriously. I take this very seriously, and our author community really appreciates our activities for a lot of the reasons that I'm going to talk about. But since we have some time, I just wanted to indicate that Editage as an organization has, we have Editage Insights. So Editage Insights is a good publication practices educational initiative on our editage.com site. We run workshops, and real live workshops, webinars, and we've attempted to educate well over 15,000 authors worldwide with major initiatives in China, Japan, and Korea, which are the hotbeds of our activity, but are also the hotbed of need. So from an Editage perspective, in working with publishers, journals, and societies, we really are positioned to help you get closer to the authors, because we really work with authors on a day-to-day basis. We are an English language editing company. We do translation, transcription, but we edit well over 100,000 manuscripts a year. And so we are heavily entrenched with the author's needs for publication, and we help them connect with journals and publishers. We help publishers connect with the journals. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach in my discussion. People who know me know that I tend to try to be provocative in order to get people to think about real issues that are happening. And in my provocation, sometimes I go out on a limb just to be provocative. Other times I truly believe what I'm saying. And so take with a grain of salt some of the positions that I might take, because I really just want you to think about the trends that are happening and what it really means for the integrity of the literature from an early career researcher perspective. So, old school. I did my PhD in the 80s. So when I think doing research, basically almost pre-internet and pre-social, certainly, and pre-communication, I would think logically that given the available tools that the early researchers have today, the technology that they have at their disposal, anybody who would embrace these technologies and tools would clearly succeed and rise above their peers in the research cycle. And I would also think that the younger generation, which is energetic and highly tech-savvy, research as an author, has a clear advantage over the older peers, just simply because of the tools that they have available. And while I reflect upon that, I also know that the literature, the general global literature, is changing very rapidly. So while this slide was generated back in 2008, 2009, and it doesn't necessarily reflect what was mentioned today about how the number of papers coming out of China hasn't quite surpassed that coming out of the U.S., but this slide had predicted that it would last in the last couple of years. Whether it has or whether it hasn't really doesn't matter. To me, the take-home message of a picture like this is that the literature is changing very rapidly, not only in its complexity, its volume, but in the demographics contributing to the literature. And so from a publisher's perspective, I say that it has its own complexities in the vastness of the literature. It has its complexities in the quality of the papers that you're receiving at level of triage. But from an early career researcher perspective, consider this. They have to generate their career. They have to gain a share of voice in this literature. Now, when I was doing my research, getting share of voice was difficult enough back in the 80s. I can't imagine what gaining share of voice, the challenges of doing so today might be. And if you look at the China curve, which is the one that's going through the roof, this is real. The fact that the number of papers coming out of China are on an exponential incline is real, and there's no end in sight. So again, taking it back to an early career Western researcher perspective, how is a paper that they're going to submit to any journal going to have the share of voice? How is it going to get the citations? How is it going to be discoverable? How are they actually going to get through the triage when there's an enormous number of papers coming up beside them at the same time? From an Asian perspective, whether it be China, Japan, Korea, India, anywhere, or even a European perspective in some of the Eastern European countries, how are they going to compete and get their papers into Western high-impact Sci-Index journals when, in fact, the population of papers at the triage editor's desk are so great, and they are challenged not only by English language challenges, but on access to literature challenges, access to technology, access to reagents. When I visit Brazil, I hear the challenges that they have just to get laboratory reagents into Brazil. It can be, where we have it FedExed overnight, it takes them 2 weeks to get some reagents, if not months. So the competitiveness to get into the world literature is a very real and palpable challenge that early career researchers have. It isn't just English language, it is the research process, but I prompt you with the concept that it's the volume of literature itself and the ability to penetrate through the barriers of not only peer review, but just simply triage at the editor's desk. So, taking a step over to China, China by design is creating that curve. We think that it's happening by mass action, but I'm here to say by my observations that it is by design, by Chinese government design, dating back 10 years, and here are some of the indicators that I perceive that make it so. Early on, it was very easy to get a PhD in China. There was a vast number of PhD slots available. The threshold for entry was challenging just because of population and statewide exams and things of that nature. But to get a PhD slot was fairly easy. Now, here's a difference compared to Western circumstances. In China, many of you may be not aware that I do not choose what area of study I go into my PhD. I do not choose my mentor. I take exams coming out of high school, and much of those choices are made for me at a very early age. So I'm graduating probably 2 years younger than a Western peer, and I'm being told what area of study I need to study in, what lab I'm going to, and what I'm going to be working on. So the emotional affect that ties to my research is not the same as a Western scholar. And that you need to take into consideration when you're reading papers coming from Asian scholars, specifically China, is that they are writing this paper. It may not be a choice of passion for them in research. So there's also a very large pool of highly motivated researchers. They're highly motivated not only in their research ethic, but in culture. The Chinese culture, they fundamentally want to do what's right. I've talked to hundreds of MDs and PhDs in China when I go over there and have given lectures and talks about publication ethics and good publication practices. And they fundamentally want to understand what is good publication practice, what are good publication ethics. They simply just do not have access to the knowledge base, nor do their peers. ICMG guidelines, what's that? Jeffrey Beal and his initiative and Beal's list of predatory publishers, they have no idea because Jeffrey Beal's platform is on WordPress, and WordPress is blocked by the great Chinese firewall. So they have no concept of what a predatory publisher is, and hence they are fodder for the predatory publishers. They're just ready for the picking, not only because culturally, how could they possibly believe that someone would want to scam them? That's not in their culture. But secondly, they have no idea that these things are going on and do not have the resources to understand where predatory publishers are. There used to be a relative ease in publishing in Chinese journals. The Chinese journal presses had typically what was called peer review, but almost everything got published. It was not selective peer review. And so by design, you can see large, vast numbers of researchers, easy to publish, and then the government ignited that, put a flame underneath and ignited with the fever by cash incentives and other things to incentivize them to strive for higher impact journals, Sci-Index, Western English language journals. Then the Chinese government started reducing the PhD slots, and that competition got fierce. So fever to publish plus the competition to get into these PhD slots. And then the government said, okay, to get your PhD, you have to publish in English Western journals. 2 papers in English Western, Sci-Index, English language papers to get your PhD, period. You don't do that, you don't get your PhD. An MD, in order to practice in a top-tier hospital in Shanghai or Beijing, has to also publish English language papers in the Western literature, or they don't get the opportunity to practice in high-level institutions. So you feel the squeeze, and with new quality expectations and ethics reform that has taken place, healthcare reforms that are taking place, there is this huge vice going around the researchers, and that is driving this publication curve, and is also driving tendencies towards fraud, tendencies towards other things. I've introduced the concept earlier in the meeting about predatory author services. We talk about predatory publishers, but predatory author services are feeding into this need by running paper mills and other types of things. So we undertake surveys and do research within Editage among our author pool, and we ran 2 sets of surveys, one to the Asian author community and one to the English language Western editorial community. And this was research done a couple of years ago and published in Learned Publishing. I'm just bringing it up now because it's timely, I believe. And so it was Japanese authors, Chinese authors, Korean authors, and then journal editors. So in total, we considered only complete responses, 326 for Asian authors and 54 journal editors. And there was a number of questions that we asked, but one in particular was this: how well do authors understand publication ethics? And it's a butterfly chart that on the green side is how the authors responded, on the red side is how the editors responded. On the green side, the bin size is how well they believe they are performing on each of these things with respect to copyright, conflict of interest, IRB approval, authorship, salami slicing, plagiarism, data fabrication. So green is how well they believe that they are performing and understand these concepts. Red on the editorial side is how the editors believe they are not performing. So polar opposites of questions and polar opposites of results. The Asian author honestly believes that they are acting ethically, and the Western editor does not perceive there's a bias or a functional perception just because of the papers that they receive. They do not perceive that the Asian author acts in this way. So there is a gap, a huge gap in English, in the East-West divide that requires education. And I say that this education just can't happen fast enough. I mean, we have tried at Editage for the last 2-3 years putting incredible resources into trying to educate. Publishers have been putting incredible resources, and we're just scratching the surface and really having no impact in the literature. Now, I take it back. I'll do one more thing. So there's a list of companies there, and I often talk about it in China when I talk in other places. And I ask them, how many of these do you actually recognize? And there's huge dead silence in the room. They may recognize ResearchGate, they may recognize Mendeley, they certainly recognize Reference Manager, and this is not an exhaustive list. The surprising thing was I was just in Montreal, the University of Montreal, a couple of weeks ago, and I had a group of 85 postdocs, and then I did a focus group for 4 hours with another 25, and I asked them, I went through this list, and I asked them, how many do they recognize? And to my shock, they did not recognize any more than those of my Asian colleagues. ResearchGate, Mendeley, and Reference Manager. That means they had no idea what ORCID was. They had no idea what Authenticate or Crossref or Crosscheck or the backbones of Editorial Manager, Scholar One. They had no idea of Beall's List and Scholarly Open Access. They had no idea. And that shocked me because I would fully expect, getting back to my earlier comments, that these kids, I'm dating myself, are technologically savvy. They're web savvy. They're supposedly industry savvy. I would have absolutely expected that the Montreal group would have known at least, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, 5 of them, not 3 of them. I would have expected at least half of them. Altmetric, I mean, they go to Nature papers, Biomed Central, Altmetric. The Altmetric donut is right there, but they don't know what it represents from a company perspective. So, again, feeding into the fact that education can't be fast enough, not only on publication ethics, but on what we do as an industry. And you know, I was asking them, what do they want? What does an early career researcher need? And there's dead silence in the room. We need lower APCs. And that led to the conversation of why APCs are the way they are that I disclosed earlier in one of my comments. But that's all that they could come up with. And one can say, okay, well, it's a youthful generation. They don't really have ideas. They're young in their career. They're not exposed. I personally provoke you by saying that it's a failure of our industry not to make this more in their face and relevant to them. How can they not know about altmetric or Figshare or Overleaf, or how could they not know about authenticate and cross-reference and plagiarism checks if they don't understand? If Western authors don't understand that their papers are undergoing a plagiarism check and submission, that is not heading off the challenges of plagiarism that we have and the integrity of our literature. So 2 things scare me, 2 things keep me awake at night. There's a lot of things that keep me awake at night, but these 2 things keep me awake at night. And that is, how does a young early career investigator, how are they going to manage a share of voice in this literature? How are they going to get accepted, published, read, and cited, given the vastness of the literature that is today? To get a good paper in a good journal is going to be ever increasingly difficult. And how can we as a community not make it simpler for them, but at least show them the path on how to do that more effectively and efficiently? And what can institutions do, and what can the publishing community do to actually support the challenge that they face? On the predatory practices point of view, and this is becoming a passion of mine, is the whole axis of publication now has predatory elements. There are people out there who are trying to monetize and make predatory every aspect of the publishing process. Editorial board solicitation, peer reviewer solicitation, manuscript solicitation, peer review practices, the whole peer review process. And I submit predatory author services. That's authorship for sale. That leads to plagiarism. You have writing fraud. And one of my biggest things that I'm getting very concerned about is the availability of data, not necessarily big, complex data, but the availability of well-organized medical data that is charts and tables. That data is just going to be stolen by these paper mills. And so big data can lead to much greater fraud in the literature. And so I am beginning to worry about big data meaning big fraud. If we think that we're facing fraud right now in plagiarism, we can detect plagiarism. We cannot detect stolen data, and we have to figure out how to begin to do that. We can detect altered images, we can detect plagiarism, but we cannot detect stolen data. And so in 2 years' time, I really worry that our education is not going to be fast enough for not only Asian authors, but Western authors alike, and that no matter how fast we educate about these issues, the idea of unethical practices is going to outpace our education to inform these young authors about unethical practices, and that's going to lead to a corruption of the literature. The integrity of the literature is at stake, in my opinion, and we have to do something about it. So I end with a slide that I jokingly show, and Good and Bad and the Ugly, again dating myself back to the 70s. But there was a movie that was released in China in 2013 called The Chef, the Actor, and the Scoundrel. And it's actually about the kidnapping of a researcher. And I thought the title was just so perfect because the chef is the researcher, the one who's wanting to work ethically. The actor is the one who's not really working ethically in the research community, and the scoundrel are the predatory ones who are absolutely not working ethically and in fact are preying on those who are trying to work ethically. So I leave that as just a humorous note, but to pinpoint that the author that is being caught up in predatory practices are in many regards being caught up naively, and we have to be sensitive to that in rejection letters and other things, not only culturally sensitive, but sensitive that they may have been caught into this, not through their own volition, but just because they sought an author service and they were totally unsuspecting of what the outcomes would be. And with that, I thank you.